Okay, a warm welcome to everyone from Mind and Life Europe. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening. I know that a number of you are joining us from different time zones. It's really wonderful to see you all in the live Zoom room and also for those who are following on YouTube. My name is Johanna Megan. I'm the Programs Manager at Mind and Life Europe. And on behalf of all of us at Mind and Life Europe, I want to welcome you to semester 4 of the Core Enaction program. And I can see already that many of you in the live Zoom room, and I know others following on YouTube, have been with us since the beginning of the Core Enaction program, since fall of 2022, when we first launched this online learning program. But for those who were not with us, just to give you a little bit of a context for the journey that we've taken over the last year and a half now. And just to give you an idea of the journey we've been on, and then also where that's taken us in our reflections about this semester, semester 4, which we're going to dive into this evening. So for those who are new, Emily launched the program initially in fall of 2022 as a way of filling in what we saw as a sort of gap in most standard curricula. So the program as a whole was designed to initiate students, researchers, scholars, and also practitioners from a variety of different domains into the world of enaction and enactive thinking. So we began in semester 1 with what we called genealogy, retracing the origin story and major building blocks of the enactive view across cognitive science, cybernetics, philosophy, Buddhist thought, and more. And then in semesters 2 and 3, we actually undertook a close reading of The Embodied Mind by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche. And this was really the foundational text in which the enactive framework was elaborated from a cross-disciplinary perspective. And during those 2 semesters, we were guided by different experts on each of the chapter's central themes, and also by our wonderful host those 2 semesters, Marek Magan, who many of you may know, and I think I saw in the live Zoom room with us this evening. And so this semester, semester 4, this is our final semester of the current iteration of the Core Enaction program. We're really hoping to extend and expand our work together from the previous 3 semesters, leaning more into the ways that the enactive approach informs, both implicitly and explicitly, the practices of people in the world today. So you'll see that this is structured differently from past semesters. And our hope is that this semester will be a series of gatherings, or what we call situations of encounter, to follow a term from Masumi, for a generative conversation among the different guest speakers and with the participants as well, with participatory sense-making as the unifying thread to the semester. And I just want to say that it's no understatement to say that this semester would not exist were it not for our 2 remarkable hosts, Dr. Hanna de Jager and Dr. Letitia Renaud, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, as well as the other members of the planning committee, including Amy Cohen-Varela and the entire Emily team who we have with us tonight. So our 2 hosts, Hanna and Letitia, were really instrumental in bringing together the phenomenal and phenomenally diverse guest speakers you've seen on the program and that we'll be hearing from throughout the semester, some of whom have joined us this evening, so we'll hear their voices later this evening. And it was with Hanna and Letitia that we were able to build the semester from the ground up through the lens of different practices and ways of being in the world. So this first session, we'll be hearing from Dr. Hanna de Jager on participatory sense-making, but then next session we'll be looking into thinking divergently, and then healing, moving and improvising, curating, teaching, learning and transmitting, computing differently, and then finally a session on enactive ethics, difference becoming participation. So just to more formally introduce you to our 2 hosts, and then we'll introduce you as well to our guest speaker this evening. Dr. Hanna de Jager is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist, and she's fascinated by how we think, work, and play, and as she puts it, how we live and love together. To study this, she's developed the enactive theory of intersubjectivity called participatory sense-making. She believes that interdisciplinarity and open-mindedness are essential for this work, and she collaborates regularly with psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, sociologists, physical therapists, systemic therapists, movement experts, and people from the neurodivergent communities. And if you haven't had the chance to read Hanna's beautifully written academic papers over the years, including her book, in linguistic bodies, I'd really encourage you to give them a read because they're crisp and limpid and very humane and down to earth. So it's a great introduction for those of you who are just discovering participatory sense-making and the enactive framework. And our other host, Dr. Letitia Renaud, is joining us as a psychologist and a researcher. Her interests include topics related to enactive approaches, participatory methodologies, and mental health, and first-person methodologies more generally. Letitia has a PhD in psychology from the Universidade Federal Fluminense in Brazil, and she's done an internship at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Liège in Belgium. Currently, her work seeks to connect some of the concepts from the field of cognitive research and the therapeutic and cultural practices in different social contexts. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to you, Letitia, to introduce our main guest speaker, Dr. Rebecca Todd, this evening. And then Hannah will launch us into our primer on participatory sense-making.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the MLE team. And well, I would like to introduce Rebecca Todd, our invited speaker for this session. Rebecca Todd is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology of the University of British Columbia. She has a master's degree in dance from UCLA and worked as contemporary choreographer and dance writer for a number of years. She subsequently received a PhD in developmental science and neuroscience from University of Toronto and postdoctoral training in cognitive neuroscience at the Rotman Research Institute and University of Toronto. Her research program focuses on brain and behavioral processes underlying the interaction between human emotion and cognition in health and in mood disorders, and studied in the lab and in the world. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for being with us today. And yeah, I will let the floor for you. So thank you.
Thanks, Letitia. No, I'm really excited to be here and to talk about my journey to participatory sense-making, or how I learned to stop worrying and love the enactive approach.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So in the first, just for the structure of the evening, so everyone has this in mind. So the first part of the evening will have primer with Hannah, and then we'll invite you, Rebecca, really into interaction with that, and that'll be the time when we can hear about your research, and then hopefully after we'll take a short break, and then we'll have more time with you after the break. So I'm really, really glad that you've been able to join us today.
Yeah. Just a brief note about the structure of the semester. We'd like to share with you that it was like a challenge for us to build this semester because it's quite different from the others. And we'd really like to make these sessions like a dialogue and structured differently. So let a lot of room for questions and silence and space for conversation. So it's like an experiment that we will try to build together, and we would like to invite you to test and experiment this with us. So yeah, we will have the presentations, and then we will try to make this more of a dialogue, a participative dialogue. So thank you, and Han, please. Feel free to start.
Yes, I found the unmute button. Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this really exciting semester. I'm so glad to see all of you here, people I know and people I don't know yet. Welcome, welcome. Yes, so we will make this indeed an experiment in participating in sense-making together with all of you. But I am going to start with a more traditional presentation to give you sort of the basics of participatory sense-making as best as I can. And this will be a kind of reference point for the rest of the semester. But really what I'm hoping to do with it is to encourage us all to think about and to relate to and from our own practices in an active knowing, being, and doing. And what you bring to it, all of you, is super important to that. And we are looking forward a lot to going into dialogue about that. So in a way, participatory sense-making, I will give a primer on the theoretical framework and some of the things it has been able to do. But what is important in this is that what I really want to put out there, first of all, is that we are all, each of us, by virtue of being humans, intersubjective experts. We have great intersubjective expertise because we all grew up out of another person in interactions with other people. We have very deeply physiological, emotional, mental, bodily situated intersubjective expertise. And this expertise, I want to put out some basic terms already, is in being and becoming together, in living and living together, and in changing and transforming ongoingly in relation. But this all may sound like something we all know, but at the same time, also I think many of us are very aware that this is very difficult, often extremely difficult, especially in the given situations that are surrounding us in the world today. So it's definitely not, even though it's an approach to living together and playing together and so on, it's also aiming to address the difficulties with precision about what we do intersubjectively with each other, both in our intimate relationships and on the biggest global levels. So in a way, when I talk about intersubjectivity and what the enactive approach can do with how we are intersubjectively, is to take a wide perspective on this phenomenon and then to design concepts and to design methodologies and ways to enter into the experience of intersubjectivity that gives us precision in order to understand it. And I'm very interested in putting this theoretical framework to you as a proposal, and in hearing from you what your insight is into the precisions of what we do intersubjectively with each other. And I think because I come from cognitive science, where we have not really managed to look at intersubjectivity in the way I'm going to propose so much. There are elements of this which I call human knowing that we are still missing in cognitive science. But cognitive science is on the verge of proposing this and has done it in different places, and have other approaches as well adjacent to it, for instance, feminist approaches. But I think we could, in everyday life and in science, still do with becoming better at understanding this intersubjective expertise and at our very intersubjective expertise. And in some way, we can bring all of these issues back to the question what to trust and what can we have confidence in with each other and in the world. And for that, I think in an active living logic, as we've been exploring it in the Core Enaction series, is basic. And so the theme for the whole term is an active knowing, being, and doing that together, which is, I would like to say, this human knowing, being, and doing that we all share and that we have, but which the mind sciences, as I said, have not really managed to understand very well, because their emphasis has been on supposedly high-level forms of cognition, such as mathematics, planning, categorizing, reasoning, all those kinds of traditionally thought of high-level forms of intelligence, which are indeed impressive. But I wonder whether they are really our most sophisticated forms of knowing. And when I point to that, I really aim to say something about, to bring it directly in relation to a certain practice. Understanding dementia, for instance, if you take a kind of high-level cognition approach, you might try to understand how a person with dementia lives by understanding their emotional skills through looking at whether they can categorize pictures of a person showing emotions. And then when a person cannot do that anymore, a traditional mainstream cognitive science and also medical science approach is that if a person isn't able to categorize emotion pictures, then they lose their capacities, their emotional skills. But when this goes into everyday life practice of people living with dementia, this kind of view can restrict people's possibilities, actually. Whereas if you have experience with dementia, living with dementia, or a family member with dementia, what is more fruitful for your relation and for your intersubjective expertise is to pay close attention to what a person is capable of intersubjectively. And this requires a different science of looking at intersubjectivity and cognition. And that's what we are proposing with this work. This is one example of that. And there is research in many different fields. I'm only putting one example here about how we can keep care fully alive, as the title of this paper suggests. And maybe Beck has something more to say about this as well. I don't know if today, but for sure she has a lot of expertise in that too. There's a way of moving with carers and persons living with dementia that is much more recognizant of what people can actually do and how we can be better at it. So this, what we can actually do, having the phenomenon in view well, and also working for our capacity to be as good as it can be, that's kind of the basics of this approach. So this, not having this human knowing in view so well in traditional cognitive science has implications for how we can live together. And we need to be careful with that. And as I said in the beginning, this human knowing, we all have that. We can trust that, and also we can do with ways of better seeing it and better understanding it. So we can make a kind of contrast between traditional abstract forms of knowing that are based on a false idea of universality and that are often hegemonic and technological only, and thereby reduce individuals to their kind of use value almost. That's a kind of pinnacle of cognition, which it's there and it's fine, but we need to nuance that picture quite a lot by bringing in human engaged knowing. And this human engaged knowing is concrete, it's engaged and engaging. It's always risky because it involves everyone, the people we study, the people we think about, the people we have our practice with, say patients. And it involves also us, practitioners, researchers, thinkers, deeply. And so it makes it inherently ethical. And it also makes it so that the kinds of theories we want, the kind of science we want, is one that cultivates becoming and participation together, while also being really precise at dealing with real, actual phenomena. And we can expect phenomena to be ongoingly changing as we interact with them. So really, this is a knowing in relation that we are looking at and dealing with here. And so the enactive approach, as we've seen throughout these semesters, and wherever you know the enactive approach from, or if you're new to it, welcome, and we will explain it here to you. The enactive approach, I think, is the best way we have in order to look at that kind of knowing. Here are some, only just a few of some basic works in the enactive approach. I'm not going to go into them very much. You can look them up if you like, and maybe I'll share slides or something like that. But also, I want to say that the enactive approach started maybe officially in a way, or in the early 90s. But of course, there is a lot of background knowing or historical knowing that it builds on, such as dynamical systems theory and phenomenology. And also, so this is historical background, but also the enactive approach is generally becoming more and more aware of adjacent or affiliated ways of thinking globally around the world right now, which we still have a lot of work to do in connecting with, and there will be some of that also in this semester together. So within the enactive approach, for more than 15 years now, maybe 18 years, we started to develop the approach called participatory sense-making, and I will explain that in some detail now, very minimally and basically. So participatory sense-making is about how we interact with each other and modulate the meanings that we have, the way we encounter the world in terms of its significance for us as sense-makers. And so I will explain sense-making in a moment, basically, in terms of what individuals do. And then another pillar of this approach of participatory sense-making is that we engage in social interactions, and that social interactions, as they emerge between us, are effective factors in our sense-making that modulate our individual sense-making of each of us. So first of all, the first pillar of this approach is that sense makers are always engaging in self-maintaining, which is indicated by this symbol here, which most of you will know. We are self-organizing beings who maintain an autonomy and relate to the environment. We are coupled to the environment, and we regulate the interactions that we have with the environment. And the basis for that is that living beings have needs and constraints that are based in their bodily self-organization, which also entails that we have a certain perspective on the world for what we need for our bodily self-maintenance. For instance, metabolically, while I'm speaking, I need to lubricate my throat. That's one way in which I maintain my metabolic identity as I'm doing this work here. You might do the same if you're listening and need something like that. But also I'm speaking in certain ways, I'm using certain words, and this is a linguistic identity that I maintain in this context where I speak differently than, for instance, when I'm talking to my sister on the phone or something like that. So we have certain perspectives and identities that we maintain based on our very situated, particular, concrete bodies. And for our particular concrete bodies, things always matter. They are at stake for us, we care, we act out of concern for our own bodily self-maintenance. And that makes that we can understand cognition in this approach as the relational process of signification between ourselves as self-organizing and our world. And I said this happens at different levels of maintaining different identities. And this is always particular and concrete, which makes it so that we are all different in this way. We all care about things, we share that, but what we care about in each moment is often different in the details. So there is a close relationship between our existence and our self-organization and observable behavior. When we see somebody, say in a therapy practice, behave in a certain way, we can take it as given that this relates to their maintenance of their self-organization at a certain level. So always a good question to keep in mind on the basis of this approach is what is at stake for this person in this moment, whether it's in your practice as an educator, or whether it is as a researcher looking at what a certain group of people say is doing when they are doing cognition. The enactive approach, as you are also well aware, is based on a life and mind continuity. So I call it human knowing here because I want to focus particularly on how humans do this sense making, but really this kind of sense making and relating to the world in terms of our senses, in terms of the smells, the flavors, what is relevant for us on the most basic sensorial level, all the way from there to the highest level of literature and poetry. Sense runs through all of that because the Latin word sapere means both tasting and sensing, but it also means our highest level of cognition and even researching. So sense runs through all of this from the lowest to the highest levels, if these are even the right terms to speak in. But one important point about this approach as well, as an introductory remark, is that living beings, I'm sorry, I'll show it again. Living beings are always in precarious conditions. Living is not a given. Living situations are always under the influence of potential breakdown, both from the internal self-organization of our metabolic and our immune bodies, say, but also from how we are in the outside world. It's always threatened in the way, this keeping living, this keeping our self-organization. And so this symbol of self-organization here, this perfect circle, is actually really not perfect, and we have to engage in adaptive behaviors to keep this self-maintenance going. This fact that this happens as a precarious process and that we need to adapt and deal with the boundaries of viability means that things are significant for us. And that's where this idea that things matter basically for us comes from. That's really what it's grounded in. And also the idea of observable behavior and our self-maintenance, how intimately connected this is. It's really one and the same basic thing. So that's for the side of sense makers, of the individuals. Now, the other pillar of the participatory sense-making theory is this fact that interaction processes can take on a life of their own. They are effective factors in how we relate to the world. And I can illustrate this. We've done this for many years, but if you're seeing this for the first time, this example is meant to show that here's Cary Grant escaping from the police in the film North by Northwest. He wants to run away, notices, oh, the police is still after me. He runs away, wants to get out of sight of the police, and then an interaction with someone happens. And his intention of running away is interrupted. And now he has to deal with this interaction process that emerges, and he has to change his intentions and choose a different course of action. This really, for us, shows vividly that interaction processes take on a life of their own. And of course, in cognitive science, this was a new idea, but sociologists knew about this very well. So in a way, bringing this idea of how interaction processes can take on a life of their own, they have their own dynamics. We can scientifically demonstrate this in many different domains, and this has been done. The interaction process is really an effective factor in how our intentions run on in the world as we engage with each other. And just to bring this point home, I want to say that as we proposed with that work, that there are two conditions for calling an interaction social. The first is that this interaction, as it erupts, emerges between us, takes on a certain autonomy. It self-regulates as well, and we have to, as individuals, contend with this self-regulation of the emergent interaction process. And this modulates our own autonomy of participation. But in order for the interaction to be considered a social interaction, each participant, each individual's autonomy or self-organization should not be reduced to such an extent that they are not able to participate anymore, that they don't have autonomy anymore. Because then you're not dealing with a social interaction anymore. So in a way, this definition is meant to set the boundaries for our thinking about what situations are still social interactions. And to illustrate this, sometimes we ask about what, in your mind, as you're looking at this, are still social interactions. Which of these situations constitute a social interaction where there is an autonomy or self-regulation of the interaction between the people, and each of their autonomies is still engaged in the interaction? So I'll give you a moment maybe to think about that. And I know that one of these pictures may be quite impactful given the world situations we have, but I think we need to not shy away or be scared about thinking about this properly, because thinking about where autonomy of one side of an interaction is still there or not is really important. But let's take maybe the surgery example here. What this kind of definition also does is to look at interactions on different levels. So when a surgical team interacts with a patient, on the biological level, the patient is, their autonomy is in a sense reduced, and the surgeons are doing an intervention. And of course, the participant, a patient when they're not awake, is not relating actively or able to participate. So that kind of social interaction is reduced. But on other levels, coupling is still going on. So the idea of giving this definition of social interaction is to give a way to think precisely about which interactions are social and in what precise ways. Anyway, this is maybe an example or an issue to go into in more detail even throughout the term. So to come back to the basics of participatory sense-making, we literally can participate in each other's sense-making, thinking that we are individuals who engage the world out of our self-organization, and how we modulate these interactions. And also the interaction that happens between us is a precarious process that we can either contribute to maintaining, or it tries to do something with our involvement. It's a complex matter. But this theory is made in order to be able to grasp this complexity. So what happens in participatory sense-making, if you like, is an ongoing balancing act between this autonomy of interactions as they engage between us and our own individual self-organizations. And that's where social acts and social agency reside, in this ongoing dealing with this tension, which never really ends as long as we engage. So participatory sense-making really is intersubjectivity understood as this interplay between interactive and individual autonomies in material, historical, concrete contexts. And it means that we participate in each other's intentions by moving together, modulating, creating, and transgressing our senses and our meanings that we make of the world. Now, so this is the theoretical basis, if you like. Now I would like to illustrate it with two examples from practice or in relation to practice. The first one is about learning mathematics. So this is an investigation of how grade 6 students in mathematics class find the area of a parallelogram. There are intricate dynamical models for looking at this kind of phenomenon, looking at how, for instance, individual students first have a kind of primitive knowing of what a parallelogram is and how the area can be found. And then these concentric circles represent increasingly dynamic or increasingly intricate ways of knowing that an individual has. And what is interesting about this model, as is explained in that paper, is that an individual moves, so this scraggly line here is how an individual moves through this understanding back and forth in dynamical ways. And their knowing goes from primitive knowing to being able to draw images to work with such questions, to having an image in mind, and so on, noticing properties. So individuals dynamically move through these different forms of knowing, which are engaged and bodily and involve drawing and formalizing and so on. But when Towers and Linden investigated these grade 6 students trying to find the area of a parallelogram in an actual live interaction, they videoed an interaction between 3 students and saw that they were trying to figure out how to do this with the parallelogram in front of them, with pen and paper and so on, and they were sitting around a table trying to figure out this problem. And then what they did was they also made a transcript of the trialogue between 3 students, Natalie and Stanley and I think Thomas, yes. They were trying to work out how this works. And so the researchers analyzed the video and transcribed in a traditional way what the students were doing. Traditionally, it's written down what each person's contribution is to the conversation. And then you get this kind of approach where they each bring something in. First, Natalie says she can try it. She measures the sides. Then her colleague says, it's 10. And that's 10, right? They're both 10. And then the top one is longer. And it's 18, says Thomas. So you can look at what happens individual by individual. And so, yeah, I'm not going to go into the depths of the example, but these researchers looking at this phenomenon from a participatory sense-making perspective noticed that it became different to actually track one individual's development of this knowing of how to, oops, I'm sorry, that wasn't me. Notice that it's difficult to track one individual. And they did an intervention which I think is brilliant. First, before this stage that I'm showing you now, they put everything that all the students said together in one block of text. So it looks like a monologue. If you look at what the students how they are talking, you can look at it as one monologue done by one person. But then the further modulation they did was to color code this monologue by the contributions of each student. So green is one of them, blue is another, and red is the third student. And then you can see clearly that the students were really building this meaning completely together. Their way of knowing was intermeshed with each other. So for instance, here it says, okay, we could multiply the area, yeah, by 18 and then see what we get. It would be this. But look at the shape. Okay, wait, I know. Oh, I know. Now these triangles, I think, is half. These triangles will make up that square though. So they really engage in a sort of monologue, which they build together, each with their own participation. And so you can say that students' thinking here truly interweaves with each other. And the way the students learn to this kind of knowledge is really built together with each other. It's also, of course, very reminiscent of Vygotsky's approach to how individual thinking is really interactively made. So the enactive approach here prompted new ways to think about interacting bodies as reciprocal perturbations and as co-acting in a complex system. And what I really find also very relevant here is that the researchers in their reflection on this work said, we learned to develop new ways of looking at and transforming our data, the video analysis and the transcripts, to bring us into closer contact with our phenomenon of interest. This is a phrase that I would like you to keep in mind. What is our phenomenon of interest, and how can we be in closer contact with it? Because that will come back in a second, in another part of the presentation. Another example, which I will just mention briefly, is that of open label placebo. So it's possible to give people placebo and to tell them that it is a placebo and yet have results. I mean, the placebo acts on what people need. It gives them what they need, even though it's a non-active ingredient, and people know this. So in a paper by Ezequiel Di Paula and Inigo Arandia from the University of the Basque Country, they proposed that participants in interventions with open placebo must overcome the non
I think we may have lost Hannah. Hannah, can you hear us?
Yeah, I think we.
Okay, if it's an internet issue, maybe let's give it a couple minutes to log out, log back in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm good.
So I will take this time just to answer a question. So Shay asked me on chat. Shay, thank you for asking what do we do when we have questions. So we'll have a time after the presentation and after the break to questions, to clarifying questions, for clarificatory questions, and then after also a discussion. So we'll have time for that.
Yeah, and as Mark very wisely pointed out, this may indeed be an intervention to make us reflect on the precarity of social interactions over Zoom. I think you framed it well, Mark, on the spot.
Yeah. And it is an occasion to practice some improvisation too.
I think I'm going to step in. There is a cue there. It's an improvisation session. So I'm just take the chance to say hello. And it's a pleasure to see some people that I know already. Amy, we talked a while ago. I don't know if you remember. Rebecca, I always hear about you, and I'm happy to finally see you and meet you. And Leticia as well. It's a great surprise to know that you are from Brazil. So hello, Shay, as well.
Hi, Nara. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for doing this and for hosting this. It's wonderful for us. We are here at Universidade Federal de Santa Maria, in the very south of Brazil. we have a study group here focused on Enaction. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to see that there are other students with you. So it's not only Nada that is there. So
Yeah.
hi, everyone. It's a group. Nice. There's also a comment by Ana Teixeira de Mello in the chat that it's interesting. It might also be an experiment. Ana, do you want to share with us your reflection?
I was just thinking about that, how we're all still engaging in this anticipatory expectation and collectively trying to make sense of what's going on. I think this does show the robustness of the human connection, you know, despite the Zoom fragility and the technology. There is a digital discontinuity, but I think there's still an analogical continuity where we're somehow still expecting the connection. So we're all engaged.
That's true. It's interesting. And we promised that we didn't plan that. It wasn't our plan, a secret plan to give an example or something like that.
Hannah's back.
Good.
This time it'll work. We can pick up with.
Are you from Brazil as well?
Ana is from Portugal.
Oh, Portugal. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't understand. Yes, Portugal.
João, is it you?
Yeah.
Are you from Brazil, I assume?
Yeah, I'm from Brazil too.
Okay.
And to me, just one thing, to me, it is very interesting that happened just in the moment that she was exposing uncertainty emerged and sharing meaning, but must be generated from scratch. To me, that is a very good example of what was being exposed in the screen on the screen.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. It's a very good example. Hi, Han.
Hi, Hannah. I'm back.
Good to see you.
Great to see you all too. Hi. Leticia, what shall we do? I just continue or?
Yeah, we were talking about that what happened was a very good example. First about the precariousness of social interactions and also the robustness, because we're all trying to make sense of what happened and the interactions were going on. So it was very illustrative.
Nice.
Yeah, you can go on.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I was reassured in the background that you were handling it beautifully. So cool. Thanks, Johanna, for that as well, for letting me know that. So okay, I need to share my screen again.
So I think May, if you're there, if you can make her co-host again. Great. Looks good.
This work? Okay.
Yep.
Yes. Right from uncertainty back into the game. So yes. In terms of open label placebo, what plays a role in this is the purposeful performance of the medical professional who attempts to lead the interaction in a certain way so that this placebo effect can happen. But what plays an important role in that as well is interactive elements. Because through this participatory sense making that then happens in the medical interaction where this placebo is offered, a certain tension is generated between the existing beliefs of the patient and the proposed treatment, because the patient knows that this is a placebo. But then this tension opens up potentialities for change, increasing opportunities for individual self-organizing to go on in surprising and new ways. Because this uncertainty, together with imagination, are enhanced in a certain direction, which shapes the shared meaning construction and concretely modulates hopes and expectations. And this happens even without expectations and cognitive information being necessary for this. And a lot of it is done in the relation between people and in the situatedness of embodied agents in complex social environments with beliefs and tensions and expectations and hopes and so on. And I think also the sensitivity to the knowing that the practitioner is there with you giving you this placebo, hoping for your getting better, and so on. All of this embodied participation and meaning making in close connection with another person helps generate this this placebo effect. Even in the case it's an open label thing. I think this is a fascinating phenomenon. And so for the final part of the presentation, I would like to give you just a brief idea. I actually will move to it through it fairly quickly, I think, but how this is a different epistemology, an epistemology that is engaged and engages the knowers that are present in the interaction that happens when we are knowing something. And I propose to think about this in terms of loving and knowing, because I think knowing is very much like loving in the presence of these tensions between being yourself and being in relation with an other, whether a phenomenon, a thing, or a person who is by definition different from you. So in knowing and in loving, you relate by being yourself in relation with someone that's different. And I think that's a tension in letting things be and letting others be. So being yourself and the other being, but being different, and at the same time ongoingly changing. And this is also something I've explained many times already in different places, but in case you're new to it, I will give the basics of it. This problem of letting things be, letting the thing that we are knowing or the person that we are engaging with be, or the being, letting them be, is something that's difficult. We may have, for instance, if we are a horse trainer, as an example of a Canadian philosopher, Kim McLaren, we may have an idea or a goal to make money by training a horse to run competitions. And if that goal is too high in our mind, we might forego the very being of the horse as a living being with needs and constraints, with its bodily engagement in the world that generates certain needs, including needs for playfulness, let alone things for good food and so on, and a good stable and lots of room to roam in. If we get that letting be of the being that we are interacting with, say the horse that we are training, if we get that wrong, Kim McLaren said, it's the fact that we easily get that wrong points to her to the idea that we learn this letting things be from letting others be, letting the people that we live with be in our social interactions since the beginning of life. And she bases this argument on Merleau-Ponty's notions of intercorporeality, which is how we relate with each other bodily in a shared world, and we act on things through others. For instance, when we are watching a football match in fascination, and we always move with the goalkeeper as the ball is coming, there's a vicarious being present in the players on the field, which makes you understand what's going on with them from your own place, and yet in a way in the same place as the players. So this intercorporeality that we have, and the intersubjectivity, which is how we how we mutually situate ourselves over against each other, is always a concrete project of taking up this this difficult tension of letting others be themselves, while us ourselves also being ourselves. So when I spoke earlier about the phenomenon, or when the mathematics education researchers looked at the phenomena of the students looking at and trying to understand how to measure the area of the parallelogram, what the researchers were noticing is that the phenomenon is actually different. It's not, as we used to think, a phenomenon of an individual moving through increasingly complex ways of understanding mathematical questions. It's rather the phenomenon is changed into a way in which these children make this meaning, learn this activity of mathematical problem solving really together, and out of that develops their own engagement with mathematical problems. So it's a turning on its head of the phenomena as you engage with them while trying to respect them. It's kind of a complex dynamics that's going on here. And in order to get this, it's important to say that letting be is not like a rosy notion of, oh, let it be, and an invitation to disengage. It's not that at all. It's actually an engaged activity in relation between knower and known, where they closely relate to each other and even modulate each other and change each other as they engage, as well as their relation is continually changing. And so this is all to do with ongoing becoming and participation. I think I'm going to go on for another about 5 minutes, just to let you know, and to finish the presentation. I think this dynamic of letting be and of loving and knowing, I think it's a little hard to understand, but where we know this dynamic really well is in loving relationships, because they are full of these inherent tensions between being yourself and being in relation. We don't only meet a person, say a sibling, who is very different from us, but also we meet in this relation where we have to contend with what the relation does with us. And especially loving relations can be very difficult in this way. They can be very determining of how to be. For instance, in sibling relations, there has been research on this, and I think we know it from our everyday lives as well, that sometimes in a relation with a sibling, you end up fighting again and again and again, even though you know both of you don't want to fight again. So this relation with a large dynamic history of patterns that you fall into is sometimes really hard to overcome. And so there is truly a tension of being yourself, having your own intentions, and the dynamical relational patterns you can fall into over against your own wishes and intentions. And in loving is the place where I think these tensions can run highest, as well as can be most wonderful. And so what love illuminates about sense-making in this tensionful way is that we are deeply involved, as the beings we are, in those we understand, whether it's people, things, or events, and in the process of understanding or knowing them. And I think this is still an ongoing project, actually. To understand this involvement really means that we will understand this tensionful, participatory human knowing. And so I think that an engaged epistemology has its paradigm case in love relationships. And for that, we need to better understand the interactive and individual self-organizations and normativities as they play with each other. And another thing that I would like to give to you as a basis for understanding these tensions of participatory sense-making is that it indicates the limits of knowing, and the limits are between under and over determination in letting be. So to give maybe an example, which I'm going to invent on the spot in terms of improvisation, an under determination, say in the case of placebo, would be where you don't think it works and you don't relate with it in any way. It doesn't change your hopes or anything. You have almost no relation with it, and then it's very unlikely to work. When there's an underdetermination in a relation of loving and knowing, means that you forego the relation actually. And then there is no real knowing because you're not engaging with the phenomenon. Whereas the other end of the limits of knowing is at the range of overdetermination, where you have a preconceived idea of a certain issue. For instance, looking at students learning mathematical problem solving, when you have an overdetermination that this is fully done only individually, and you might forget completely or not even see that there are interactive elements at play here. And then you miss the phenomenon because you have an overdetermination of what is going on with a fixed reference structure that you put onto the phenomenon, and then you miss important aspects of it. And these indicate the limits of knowing between under and over determination. We may talk about it a bit more if needed in questions. So loving and knowing are both existential dialectical tensions between being and being in relation as sense makers. And this is always full of paradoxes, uncertainties, inconsistencies, ambiguity, and contradictions. And one of the people who have thought about this beautifully, and there are many others, is Jessica Benjamin, in terms of the tensions that must be held between us as we recognize each other. And this is what I would call an engaging epistemology. So to reach the conclusion in a way, or maybe to set us on our way for the term, what is it valuable to have confidence in and to trust, and why? I think it's our intersubjective capacities, our intersubjective expertise that we all have and that we all also could do with getting to know better. And I propose that we can know them better through understanding the enactive approach in general, but in particular participatory sense-making and also loving and knowing. And this includes both at the same time and equally being yourself and recognizing that for each of us, things matter ongoingly. We engage with the world in terms of existential concerns, and at the same time, engaging and relating as a letting be, while not disengaging, which is difficult and full of strife often. And I think that's an area of research, actually, the difficulties that is something that we need to investigate further. So on a very basic fundamental level, this is a matter of learning to engage in and becoming expert at paradoxical practices. And I think that's another thing that I would like to put on the table for us for the semester, what it is to engage in these paradoxical practices of being and becoming, of being oneself and being in relation, of recognizing and holding relational tensions and tensionful relations, of navigating under and over determination, so letting go, actually not letting go, or over-determining by fixed reference points, of being and becoming in participation, and of being, by definition, because we are all different bodies, always in different situations and concretely with different concerns, which are ongoingly changing and always in relation. And so I think we can and need to and will, and this is an entire possibility to gain trust and confidence in paradoxical intersubjective practices. And these are existential, elemental, ontological, dialectical, and never finished as long as we live. We can expect this to keep going on as long as we live, of letting each other be without letting each other go. And this is a phrase that Ezekiel proposed to put this in. So as a summary, in a way, participatory sense-making theory is a conceptual framework and a way to relate to lived experience intermingled with each other in terms that hopefully offer some precision to engage in thinking about all kinds of practices, such as autism interactions, interactions between autistic people and between neurotypicals and autistic people, understanding Tourette's as a different way of being. I've done research as well on pregnancy with, my PhD student, Alejandra Martinez Quintero did that. And there are different applications in different fields. This is just to put it up there. I mean, if you're interested, you can look further. But in terms of setting us underway, this is my last slide for the term, in terms of being, knowing, and doing in an active way. This can be considered as a kind of intersubjective complexity literacy generation in relation to our expertise and in relation to three basic issues, which is that we all always share that we care about things, things matter to us, and we act out of concern. And yet we also differ in what specifically matters to us, to each of us on a given day, in a given situation, in a given interaction. And also each interactive situation will be concrete and different from every other interaction. And we have different interactive capacities, also sometimes given by the interaction process as an effective factor that takes us up in certain ways or maybe doesn't. And I think the question becomes, even though I'm not sure if it's the most general question, but how to interact and relate across difference and recognize each other's cares and concerns before anything. So in situations of great difference or great strife and difficulty in the world, recognizing that each side in an interaction, so to speak, has their cares and concerns. And if we start from there, I think that is one big step in terms of intersubjective complexity literacy. And that's the brief introduction or primer on participatory sense-making.
Thank you so much, Han, for this presentation. It was very generous for our next sections, and also for, yeah, it's beautiful. So thank you very much. I would like to invite Rebecca,
Okay, well, thank you. Can I share my screen?
please.
So I'll try to pick up where Hannah left off. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about my research on participatory sense making through dancing and preparing food. But first of all, I want to thank you for being there, Johanna and Letitia and the whole Mind and Life Europe group. And I think what I'm going to start with is the kind of narrative of the origin story of how I came to be doing research on participatory sense making, coming from my background in cognitive neuroscience. So, and it's also kind of a story of participatory sense making over time, as sort of more and more people sort of got engaged in the dialogue that led to this research program. So I'm a researcher, as Letitia said in the introduction, in the psychology department of UBC. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. So that, of course, is the study of the mind, and the study of the mind in relation to what we can measure in the brain. And particularly in patterns of activation we can measure in the human brain. So I've sort of up on the slides, I have the themes that my lab sort of research focuses on. And theme 3 on participatory sense making is quite new. And traditionally, as I'm sure most of you know, the mind has been studied in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience as if isolated brains, often very still isolated brains, or isolated brains in very still bodies, process information and send and receive information to each other across a void. And that was certainly the view that my scientific training was steeped in. And you can sort of see it reflected in the research themes 1 and 2 in this slide. But even in my more traditional research, there was one place that it kind of always intersected with inactive approaches in cognitive science. So, I'm sorry, trying to change my slide. There we go. So, again, in the inactive approach, just to sort of recap what Hannah's already said, cognition is sense making in precarious conditions, such that there's always something that matters. The environment takes on this sort of affective or motivational salience through experience. And that is what I've studied in the lab. And then this sort of salience, the importance or relevance of things to us, to our precarious continuation, guides our attention and learning and memory. And that is also what I've studied in the lab. And I've always been interested in very implicit and nonverbal ways of knowing. But again, this is all within individuals, as if we were kind of modular pods. And that's where participatory sense making really sort of builds things up to the interactional layer. And Hannah, I was making a note. I was trying to remember what you called the literacy. What was it? Intersubjective complexity literacy? It's something that psychology and cognitive psychology is not literate in at all. We tend to like to break things down into their smallest parts. And of course, participatory sense making sort of highlights the notion that sense making and cognition is fundamentally social. So it draws on, as Hannah said, inactive approaches to focus on the dynamic interaction itself, the life of its own that it takes on as a source of sense making. And so again, it's studying sort of what is affectively relevant. Of course, when we are learning as we develop as kids, we learn that certain things in the world bring good things and bad things to us, and we learn about them and attend to them. And we often do that in social interactions. We're socialized by our caregivers and our families. So much about what is affectively important is something that emerges from a social interaction. And that was something that the tools that I was working with in the lab were just not even starting to get at. And there was a sort of another piece of it as well that Letitia mentioned in the interaction. That is that I had a background in dance. I was working in doing contemporary choreography and dance writing in Toronto, and I was working with an improviser called Lisa Nelson, who really treated dance improvisation as research in cognitive science and perception and action. And I was also directing dancers, and I was really interested in how their mental imagery, their attention and memory and emotion could be used as a tool to shape how they moved and how the audience perceived their dances. So sort of with all this, I sort of moved into cognitive science. I went back to school to study cognitive science and neuroscience. And I went through 10 years of training, and I was originally interested in studying dancers as experts and taking a neurophenomenological approach. But at that time, the training that was available to me, the technology that was available to me didn't really go in that direction. And I went a much more conventional route. So what finally set me on the path of sort of using participatory sense making as a way of framing my research and devising research that would sort of test hypotheses that come out of participatory sense making in real world situations. So this is where the Shaggy Dog story really starts. So a few people came into my life sort of at the right time. So the first person was Hannah, the first time I met Hannah, she came down the very long driveway to our house in the mountains of eastern British Columbia. She came down with her partner Doran and Doran's two kids, and we sat in the living room and talked. And that was the first time I met her. And then she came back the next year and the year after that when we had these gatherings at our place in the Kootenays, interdisciplinary gatherings. And there she presented some of her work on participatory sense making and loving and knowing. And then maybe a year or two after Hannah came down my driveway, a Brazilian choreographer, Ivani Santana, just burst into British Columbia, burst into Vancouver. She came here on sabbatical. And she focused on dance improvisation, and she was very interested in enactive approaches to cognitive science. And so she spent a year talking to a number of us, to me and to Evan Thompson and to Hannah, and devised a research program, and also came out to the meeting in the Kootenay Mountains, and with the exchange about participatory sense making got stronger. And so that is Ivani in the middle, and of course Hannah on one end and my cousin Sarah on the other end. So then COVID happened, and I teach an undergrad cognitive neuroscience class at University of British Columbia, and Ivani gave a guest presentation on her work on participatory sense making. And based on our conversations, she had devised a dance improvisation experiment that I'm going to tell you a bit about. And I had some students in the class who were very interested in that work and needed a laboratory project. So they took on Ivani's experiment, and then Ivani was influenced by participatory sense making, but then when my students sort of started taking on the experiment, it became much more focused directly on ideas of participatory sense making that are sort of front and center. So then the two more people came into my life at just the right time. Stephanie Blaine Marias is a biomedical engineer she's at McGill University in Montreal, and she is a musician, and she takes a very participatory sense making. I don't think she would frame it that way, but participatory sense making and neurophenomenological approach to working with nonverbal populations with music and movement, including people with dementia. And so she actually started working with the undergraduate student working on Ivani's experiment to teach some really useful methods for measuring synchrony and coordination of the interaction itself. That's sort of the moments when the interaction sort of takes on a life of its own, when the sort of and the tensions between the individual agent's experience and the interaction as Hannah just described it. And then the last person to introduce is Paige Whitehead. Well, no, second last person to introduce, who is the undergraduate student who was trained as a dancer. She had to stop dancing due to injury, and then trained as a cognitive scientist, and is now a reborn dancer. And she got involved in the participatory sense-making project as an undergrad, and then has stayed on after graduation. And so we've sort of started an initial study that we really hope is going to be the seeds of a long research program that is informed by more collaborators who are working in dance and who are also interested in using it in a therapeutic context. So that's the dance side of the Shaggy Dog story. The food side is again, it's all about another person and sense making with another person. But Joey is a grad student in my lab, and she was at the beginning of her PhD studying how everyday objects take on emotional meaning through everyday experience. But she was using laboratory tasks, very, very traditional laboratory sort of measures. And then COVID happened, and we all just kind of separated. We were isolated, and we had this crisis of meaning. And so Joey says, I can't do this lab-based work anymore. It's just not relevant. And so she thought about what was meaningful to her, and that was food. And she was really interested on sort of looking at how that kind of food practices, recipes that arise from these repeated participatory interactions with family and community takes on this strong emotional resonance that's a crucial part of our particular history and culture. And particularly if you're an immigrant in diaspora, where you're sort of culturally and family meaningful recipes, by preparing them, you can kind of sort of reactivate practices and memories that bring these kind of family and cultural interactions back to life, even when you're alone. And for my own part, I dealt with COVID by growing food for my family and friends, tending my garden and orchard, and I just fell in love with my garden. So we were talking on the chat about participatory sense making with the more than human. I started to feel like I was in a participatory relationship with my garden. So Joey embarked on this research program that was focused on the sort of experiences of preparing food from meaningful recipes. We both started thinking of food growing and food preparation as a form of participatory sense making that was also a form of healing. So ultimately, all of this came together, and we applied for a grant a little over a year ago with Joey and Paige and Hannah and Stephanie and Ivani to carry out some initial research on participation and build collaborations beyond our own sort of research collaboration out into the food justice community in Vancouver and also the dance community in Vancouver. And so we started with a Prisma workshop. So Letitia, how are we doing for time? This could be an okay breaking point if you want to break and come back, or I can keep going.
I think we can decide this together, but I think you can keep going.
Okay.
It's okay for everyone.
Okay.
And we can have a break after.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, so I'm going to actually, now I'm going to put Hannah on the spot. So as a first step in this collaboration, she led a Prisma workshop. And really the goal of it was to establish an understanding and a practice of participatory sense making in the research practice on participatory sense making, and sort of between the researchers and some members of the Vancouver dance community on the one hand and the food justice community on the other. So that's a photo of a sort of panoramic photo of Hannah leading the workshop. And then here are some more photos of different moments in the workshop. But I was hoping that Hannah can talk a bit more about the workshop, and then I can talk a bit about what's come out of it so far. Hannah, can I put you on the spot?
I guess so. You've done it.
I'm getting revenge for the don't prepare instruction.
Yeah, thanks. Good. This is the way it works, I guess. Yeah, so briefly, a Prisma workshop is a way to enter into, to give everybody who participates an experience of interacting live in small interactions. In this case, drawing together on a piece of paper. You can see it on the left there, the second photo on the left. The middle photo on the left is two people drawing on a piece of paper together. It's kind of one interaction that is maybe a way, like a short way to do an improvised interaction with each other. And so in a Prisma workshop, we invite people to engage in that interaction and then to, through a process of individual prompting and reactions to prompting about how you sense and feel and think in this interaction. And then through a further intersubjective process to analyze the dynamics of such a interaction that's improvised in the moment together at the level of experience. So in a way, it's a complement to more third person or quantitative ways of investigating interaction dynamics. This one is on the level of experience through both individual and intersubjective engagements in a systematic protocol for doing that. Yeah, so that's what Prisma workshops can do. And we took it as a way to get to know each other in the project, yeah, as well.
Oh. Yeah, which was actually really successful. I can't think of a better way for people coming from really different backgrounds and not really knowing what each other did to start as a foundation to start working together. So even this was in October, and even so far, it laid the foundations of a collaboration with two people from the Vancouver neighborhood food networks, such that we have just submitted a grant proposal to use one of their community kitchens and use a kind of use it as a foundation for a sort of interactive process by which we use food and spices as media for sharing histories amongst members of immigrant communities in the neighborhood. And these policies, and one thing that came out of discussion after this workshop was that there's a real need for findings that support municipal policies that preserve intangible cultural assets, such as food resources, small grocery stores and restaurants that are very threatened by development in Vancouver, where sort of the independent small grocery stores and restaurants that support the food culture of immigrant communities are just getting mowed under by massive development. And we've also met with the dance collaborators to talk about how to further our explorations of using kind of dance as a laboratory for understanding how participatory sense-making guides attention and cognition. And so we're also part of a collaboration in Montreal where dancers are working with people living with dementia. So all of these, we will probably write another grant proposal in the fall to pursue those research. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the dance and food projects so far. They're very much in progress, but I can talk a bit about what Paige and Joey have been doing. So again, in terms of the participatory sense making through dance improvisation, Paige's interest is really in the therapeutic domain. She wants to work in healing practices and use it to understand ways in which nonverbal communication, such as dance, can be therapeutic. And I'm a basic science nerd, so in addition to that, I'm really interested in using it as a lab for studying how the interactive process and the qualities of interactions guide attention in a way that may persist long after the interaction is over, which is has been the subject matter of my research. So in these two studies, we were really influenced by some proposals made by the interactive brain hypothesis, which Hannah and Ezekiel proposed coming out of their participatory sense-making work. And so the first proposal is that our brains, we're now talking at the level of the brain, are tuned to engage in these dynamical interactive processes out of which sense-making emerges. So there's sort of, through the act of participatory sense-making, we tune our brains to be geared towards the act of participatory sense-making. And of course, since sense-making itself is all about what matters, is about what's emotionally and motivationally relevant, this inherently involves emotional learning. And then the other proposal is that these interactive processes may take the form of synchronous patterns that arise and break down between brains and behaviors. So this first study was really a way in which we dug into how to measure these synchronous patterns best, in a sort of using dance improvisation as a laboratory. And so how we wanted to know, how can we measure coordination in this spontaneous improvised movement? So there are lots and lots of studies out there of coordination in dance or music, but most involve music, which has this driving sort of rhythm, or involves oscillatory repetitive movements. And so most measures of synchrony between brains and bodies are designed to measure synchrony in oscillations, in pulses up and down. But a lot of everyday movement in interactions between people isn't oscillatory. So we needed to find ways of measuring that, and then relate it back to the subjective experience of the dancers, of how the degree to which they were not coordinated, for example, was influencing or associated with what they were perceiving as being relevant or meaningful. So I'm just going to show you. So this is a dance improvisation. We had about 12 pairs of dancers and filmed them from above doing an improvisational exercise that Ivani created. I'm just going to show you what that looks like. So they were instructed that they had to keep their hands on the table, and at various times they had their eyes open or closed as a way of sort of manipulating the degree of synchronous movement we expected to see in them. And then with quite a bit of effort, Paige extracted extracted measures of speed, basically speed vectors of the dancers' moving hands, as a way to measure synchrony in their speed patterns. And what was really important, because we cared about, we're really ultimately interested in a hypothesis from the interactive brain hypothesis, where Hannah and Ezekiel say that places where sense making may really shift are right before, just going into and coming out of, moments of high coordination. So we wanted first to find these ways of measuring the high coordination, as well as measure the direction that information was going in. So what Paige, working with Stephanie, did was just devise a kind of moment-to-moment way of measuring their degree of coordination, how coordinated their speed was, moment to moment, using a rolling correlation, where we could identify moments of high and low synchrony, both by using the human eye to identify it, but also using a classifier. And then also used a measure called normalized symbolic transfer entropy to just to see in the moments of high synchrony, like what direction was the information going in between people? Was one person mostly driving it, or was the influence going from one to the other fairly evenly? And then the last thing we wanted to do was to be able to link that to their subjective experience of what was going on. So here is just a couple of moments with reports of the subjective experience added. We asked them the degree to which they experienced the coordination, the steadiness of the connection, and whether they thought they were leading or following. And then we had them just write sort of comments about how they experienced what was going on. And there was variation in the degree to which their subjective experience matched what we saw objectively, sometimes quite well, sometimes not so well. Sometimes the two dancers had very similar understandings of what was going on in a given moment, and sometimes quite different. So that was quite interesting. But ultimately, we did not collect fine-grained enough subjective reports to they were not as fine-grained as our third person measures. And so I really want to redo this study, but go back and get much more fine-grained reports of what's going on subjectively. And right now, I'm actually, to be here, skipping out on some training in the microphenomenological interview as a way of getting at sort of more fine-grained phenomenological experience. We're doing some interview training with a group in Chile with David Martinez Pernia's group, if anybody knows that, as a way of digging deeper into that, so that we really can examine the hypothesis about that these shifts in meaning should occur just before or just after these moments of high coordination. And of course, one thing I've talked to Hannah, I'm also very interested in is really digging in and understanding, maybe using eye tracking, understanding how these moments also guide attention, how attention may be guided differently. Following these moments of coordination in an interaction. So I'm just gonna end the description of the dance study with another with just an example of how Stephanie's group is using dance with people living with dementia in Montreal to examine participatory sense making. So now onto food. So the third proposal of the interactive brain hypothesis that we sort of were looking at was the proposal that brain and behavior are shaped by a history of interactive experiences. And I think Hannah described that really well when she described sibling interactions, that we go into a sibling interaction sort of predisposed with this history of patterns to dance with them that we're ready to engage with. And so our initial research on participatory sense making through food was motivated by this claim, because Joey wondered if these sort of memories of these interactions where food is made and shared with family could be re-evoked even when you're cooking alone. Particularly when these recipes were important to maintaining a sense of identity and belonging. And in turn, the degree to which that could be communicated to somebody who didn't have those memories and experiences. So imagine you're 10 years old and you're helping prepare a traditional family recipe, one of your favorites for an annual celebration. How does the dance in which the cooks work on separate tasks, merge in coordinated action and conversation, and then disengage, determine each person's understanding of what's happening? How are attention and memory shaped in real time in the space between the people involved, informed by countless unverbalized and often implicit perceptions? And then later, when you prepare that same dish, years later in another country, do you re-evoke shared experience, reenacting some of those participatory patterns even when you're alone? So the first study that Joey designed set out to look at that question. So the question was, how can the affective histories of sense-making be evoked and communicated through asynchronous food preparation? So she got trios of home cooks, and she asked them to provide a recipe. And she also asked them to provide a recipe. Also asked them to provide a story about why the recipe was important to them, some information about the history. And then each of them cooked their own recipe, one of the other people's recipes where they were aware of why it was meaningful. And then in a third session, they cooked the recipe where they didn't know anything about the meaningfulness. It was just a recipe, and they had to make sense of it based on the recipe. And this was all done over Zoom. So they cooked in their own kitchens. Joey filmed them over Zoom, and then she interviewed them extensively afterwards. And what she found is that so this was a qualitative study. She did a thematic analysis on them, and she did find some really nice evidence that for these participants, cooking your own recipe evoked a lot of memory and warm emotions of one's own past. And that there was that a lot of these feelings were communicated through even when cooks were aware of why the recipe was meaningful, and that there was a very that they were also very concerned with the thoughts and intents and experience of the recipe donor, even though they were not in the room with them or didn't interact with them at all. So there was something interactive going on in their experience, even in the absence of the other cook. So Joey followed this up with another study. She just these photos are from just a couple of weeks ago, and the cooks have signed release forms. They don't mind their faces being seen, but she then took two of the cooks from the previous study and put them in a kitchen together in two separate sessions, where they taught each other's recipes in the kitchen together in real time. And I was actually at the second session, and it was really lovely to watch, because when they started cooking together, when they started going through the actions of cooking, the stories, the person who is the recipe giver for this particular session, the stories just started pouring out as soon as the interactive cooking began. And it's through the interaction of cooking, or in the next study, we're going to use spices, that we're hoping to sort of generate these stories, record these stories, and use them as evidence for these efforts to protect cultural food heritage in Vancouver. There's a motion that's I think going through the city council at the moment, and the hope is to be able to sort of to really gather a very, very sort of persuasive case for preserving these food assets. So that's it for the sort of that's it for the presentation, I just want to thank my collaborators, the lab, and some distant forebears there in black and white. And yeah, give it back over to Hannah and Letitia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this amazing presentation. I think it's a very good presentation to make us think concretely about the concepts and ideas that Han shared with us before. So it's a very, very embodied presentation
Yay!
about participatory sense making.
Yay!
So thank you. So now maybe we can have a short break given the schedule of the session. So if everyone's okay, maybe we can have 5 minutes and then come back for questions and discussion.
Okay, shall we come back for the second part? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Joanna. So unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss all the amazing questions that are in the chat. I'm trying to read them all, but it's really difficult. But we will try our best and also continuing the discussion in Slack. So now I really wanted to move to our discussion and invite. We have here with us some of the invited speakers for the next sessions. So I really wanted to invite them to make some comments and ask questions too, because considering that we will be discussing during the whole semester the questions that we are dealing here now with the presentations of Han and Rebecca, would like to invite them to make some comments. So please, we have here with us John Drury, who will be with us in the session 2. Barbara Bogantin, who will be with us in the session 4. Shay Welsh, who will be with us in the session 5. Joel Aden, who will be with us in the session 6. And also Luke Stills, who will be with us in the session 7. So please welcome, and I would like to ask you if you have some comments or questions about what we are discussing. So please, Barbara.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here.
Hello.
I just had a brief comment to mention. Some of you know I'm a professional cellist, and I play with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. I've spent most of my career playing with different orchestras, and so I'm very familiar with this participatory sense making that 100 musicians do simultaneously with one conductor leading us. And it seems like a perfect example of so many of the things that you've been talking about. And this is something that I definitely will explore when I participate in the conversation in May. And just recently I saw a colleague of mine, a conductor I know, conduct an orchestra with some particular brainwave equipment attached to his head, an electrode cap, and they were taking real-time measurements of what was going on. And that's before I speak in May. I'm going to get together with him and find out a lot more of the details so I can have more information about that as well. But I love the improvisational dance relationships, and something I know very much about from playing in orchestras.
Yeah, very, very overlapping experiences.
Thanks,
And
Barbara. Yeah, it will be great to have you with us in the session 4. So we are all looking forward to that, to know more about your practice and how the participatory sense making manifests itself in your practice.
Maybe I'm just thinking, not all of our speakers are still here, but if any other speaker wants to jump in, feel free. But also we want to open this up because we don't have that much time left in the evening so that everyone, again, there's so many questions in the chat and we can assure you we will open a Slack channel. So we hope that that'll provide a space for the discussion to continue, and we'll also have our faculty on there with us so we can keep going back and forth. But if anyone wants to, come forward with a question or a reflection, personal reflection, or maybe a continuation of what we were just talking about, feel free. So yeah, I think we've got someone already who raised your hand, Matthew.
Hello. That was really great to hear, especially some of the theoretical background stuff. What interests me most in that realm that makes participatory sense making what it is, and also what it's not, precisely concerns its paradoxical nature. And so I guess I would like to understand more of the logic of the paradoxical and how that can be understood, I guess, in the mathematical sense of the dynamic systems, attractor, repulsor space, if that is a possible analogy, or if, I just found that the most interesting. So maybe I'll start with that reflection, and no one has to answer that, but.
that sounds like a Hannah question.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, a big part of the background of this is in dynamical systems theory. So yeah, a lot of what we talked about today is also researched with that framework in order to analyze it in detail, and we feel very affiliated to that. But to go into the details, that's really more Ezequiel Di Paolo's domain than mine. But for sure, that link is completely there, and I also find it fascinating to think about it in formalized ways like that. That's important to it, totally. Ralph?
Ralph, I think.
Ralph, yes.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hannah and Rebecca. Something, as I put on the chat, something that interests me a lot at the moment is AI and technologies, because we live in a cognitive ecology, if you like, which is permeated by them all the time. We can't get rid of them. And our interaction is often mediated by them, some of which, like ChatGPT, etc., aren't linguistic bodies. They aren't interactors in our sense. And you gave the example, the teaching example, because I'm in the area of education. You gave the interesting teaching example where the interaction was between three students, three linguistic bodies interacting linguistically together. Now, if one or two of those interactors is an AI system, could that have an effect on not only on the interaction itself, which obviously it would do, but on the capacities? If this was really, I'm looking sort of futurology at the moment, if this was really an integral part of learning and teaching from early years up to university, how would that impact on our ability to learn the capacities necessary that you were talking about, Hannah, and to trust them and to be confident in them? I mean, is this a worry that I have which is unfounded, or is this something that could possibly happen in the future? I don't think it's happening now, but I'm thinking about when these things, because if you open Facebook or internet, you find that companies that are selling these AI tutors now, you can learn a foreign language only interacting, for example, with an AI system. That's the way most people learn foreign languages these days, apparently. Yeah. So I wonder if both of you could say something about this, if you have any ideas about this.
That's so interesting. I think it's mostly I had a question. I actually have been thinking of more in terms of tech, more actually on the positive end. So I've been involved with a project with a colleague in computer science. We've been framing in terms of participatory sense making, where she has these. She's designed these swarms of interactive tactile robots. So they're haptic technology that that were designed for sort of groups of teenagers to interact with remotely. So that's a kind of thing where technology is extended. It's the opposite of what you're saying, basically. It's kind of extending the participatory sense-making aspect through technology, but you're talking about the opposite. You're talking about all of the complex ways in which AI and large language models, in which kids growing up with them, which we're barely able to wrap our minds around, like what's it going to be like to be educated in a world where that sort of where the other agent isn't an agent, isn't an embodied agent. What do you think, Hannah?
Oh, I think it's a very complex question that we have to be very careful with as well, in terms of what's been really clearly shown in Abeba Birhane's work about bias is that AI brings forward without us realizing it. I think that's an absolute baseline thing to take into consideration when talking about that. And yeah, what you're talking about, Beck, having dynamics between systems, that's interesting to look at. So when they don't bring forward language that they pick up from the internet that has biases built into them. But it's such an enormously complex question. I don't feel really equipped to go into it so quickly with a lot of nuance. But as was mentioned in the chat, Luke Steels is here, who will be talking about computing later on in the term as well in relation to this. So you can expect for sure more on this topic. I don't know if Luke wants to say something, or we go to the next people who have questions.
So maybe Persian. I don't know if I'm mispronouncing your name. I'm sorry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a somewhat basic question about the theoretical framework of participatory sense making. So you mentioned how Dr. Yeager mentioned how traditionalist cognitive science tends to have a certain restrictive perspective on cognitive activity, but also that we are all in fact inactive experts in sense making. So is there this slightly tricky maybe, but how do we, from an inactivist perspective, understand or critique the more traditionalist cognitivist tendency, or the way cognition has been typically understood as a computational information processing kind of system? I'm familiar from a more phenomenological background where there is good criticism of this kind of thinking, but how, from a sense-making inactivist position, where do we place the kind of cognitive activities that have been typically considered traditionally in cognitive science? I don't know if it's a very meaningful question, but I'm curious from this kind of critical place where to position ourselves theoretically.
Yeah, there is a lot of critical work being done over the years in line with developing the enactive approach. Like you say, in phenomenology, there is a lot, but also from analytical perspectives. Mainly, I think the criticism is usually about considering that a living being relates in terms of meaning for its living situation to the world, whereas in traditional approaches, where meaning comes from isn't asked of a cognitive system. It's just assumed that meaning is there, and that meaning is then tracked and transformed in tracking information, processing, and so on. But the basic question of where this meaning even comes from, why things matter, isn't there. And also, I think what agency is in terms of how a living being relates and regulates its interactions with the world is also not, in traditional approaches, something that is explicitly theorized as such in terms of, again, what meaning is for the living system. So I think those are two main elements that are missing in traditional approaches, that are very much underlying much critical work that has been done in different places. And that started really early on, in the 70s and before already.
If possible, could I ask for maybe later in the chat more references to maybe in the first semester, which I did not attend, if there's some references or texts that I could refer to about the prehistory of Enaction, I'd be interested in that maybe for later maybe.
Yeah, we can share links actually to all of the sessions that were recorded on our YouTube channel. So you can see all the 7 sessions from semester 1, which really tracks that early history, second order cybernetics, up until really the writing of the embodied mind. So, and there's lots of references mentioned within those talks that you can also gather. So we'll share that in the Slack.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have time to take one more question from Nara. Nara?
Thank you. Hi. Thank you everyone again. It's wonderful to be here. I just wanted to hear more and maybe ask how you, both of you, or all of you, understand trust. Because at first, in the beginning of the talk, what came to my mind was, well, there are people that I trust more, people that I trust less, and the reasons why I trust them more or less. And when I lose trust in someone, how can I better recover trust? And so I was thinking in the more trusting another person. I was thinking in that idea. But then I remembered that there are some people here doing some work on phenomenology and they talk about a sense of basic trust. It's a monadic trust or confidence, and it's a trust in the world. It's an existential trust in that, things are gonna work out well, and I don't know, something like that. It's a kind of structure of experience. But then in the final slide, in one of the final slides of your presentation, Honey, you said trust and confidence in paradoxical intersubjective practices. And then I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm trusting the very dynamics that is between us. And I just, I just wanted to hear you more about this.
Yeah, great question. And you gave the answer. I mean, it's in the dynamics, I think, yes. So, and I think maybe that's in a way like a revelation, like, oh yes, there are the dynamics there. When we make it explicit that they are there, and if we realize they're there, then we also can get to know them better and maybe have some kind of grasp on them, even though that's only temporary always. And then we can begin trusting also in the dynamics. And it just doesn't have to only lie with oneself or with the other, but also things can change because of interactive dynamics, which are effective factors then also in trust. And I think seeing that gives us also a possibility that we can trust, that we can give ourselves over to this complexity while remaining active agents in it, by understanding it as well as engaging in it in the moment. Right? So trust becomes also this complex thing, but the more we begin to understand that complexity and relate to it and be within it, maybe that is also something that we can begin to trust as well. And maybe already in many cases do trust, because we do have experience with improvising as well and so on, or can realize that. And yeah.
And that's also actually is a great empirical question. It's something we could look at just how in different kinds of situations, both where maybe people come in with high levels of sort of strong relationship and trust with people who don't, to look at the relationship between the subjective experience of trust and the dynamics of an interaction as it unfolds. It's a really interesting question.
Thank you, thank you.
Great. Maybe in a way, since it's almost it's past the time, it could be a nice question to bring into the next session, where we'll be talking about thinking divergently, differently, across differences with each other. The question of trust, I'm sure, will come up in that session again.
Yeah, so I think, so if you're okay, Hannah and Letitia and Rebecca, to close there. So this was an overwhelmingly rich evening. I think we have an embarrassment of riches before us, so a big feast. So on our side, thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Rebecca, for these presentations, which I think will keep reverberating in our minds for the next several weeks. So, and thank you, Letitia, for your beautiful holding of the space. And so we will continue. Our next session will be on April 10th, meeting at the same time. So from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Central European Summertime. And again, as we mentioned, we know that we really didn't have as much time as we anticipated for discussion and breakout groups. Next time, we'll make a real effort to make sure we have some breakout groups so people can get to know each other better in smaller groups. And then we'll have more time also for exchange between the participants and speakers. But in the meantime, we will set up a Slack channel so that the discussion can continue, and we'll be sharing some materials there. So we look forward to having you back in just a couple of weeks, so 2 weeks from now. And we have other programs too at Mind and Life Europe, many of you know about, one of which is a contemplation, an open contemplation session. If you're interested, you can find out more about that on our website and our newsletter. But on that note, so thank you once again, everyone, for joining us, all the participants from all over the world, and also everyone on YouTube as well. And thanks again to Hannah and Letitia and Rebecca for your beautiful presence, your participatory contributions this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And looking forward for the next sessions. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening or a good day. Bye.